Hello Internet! The purpose of today's video will be to discuss one of my favorite thought experiments in the history of ethics, namely RM Hare's Cannibal Island thought experiment from chapter 9 of his masterpiece from 1961 on the language of morals, which happens to also be one of my favorite books in the history of ethics. Basically, I teach this thought experiment in my Intro to Philosophy class, and it's actually one of my favorite thought experiments in the history of moral philosophy. And I realized that nobody has actually made a video on this yet, and so I thought that it would be sort of a niche worth filling, namely explaining this particular thought experiment on the internet. So I figured this is a way for me to sort of give back to the philosophical community, so to speak, by posting a video on the internet that might explain something that people might otherwise not be familiar with. So to say a little bit about myself to start off, my name is Jacob Koval. I am a PhD candidate at Florida State University in the Department of Philosophy. I received my MA at Florida State in 2022. I am super interested in metaethics and metaphilosophy. I'm particularly interested in the anti-realism versus realism debate in metaethics, as well as the naturalist versus non-naturalist debate at the metaphilosophical level. I plan on writing my dissertation within the next couple of years. I consider norm expressivism to be a big research interest of mine. I'm very interested in the various anti-realist theories in metaethics and about morality. In the past, I have considered anti-realism to be, in the past, I have considered expressivism to be a very compelling theory of moral language. Of course, whether or not expressivism is compatible with there being moral truths is itself a controversial question that philosophers do not agree on. But nevertheless, I found expressivism to be a very compelling theory of moral language for a long time. Currently, I'm relatively agnostic about the nature of moral language, largely because I think that I am skeptical of the degree to which we should be relying on intuitions as evidence in philosophy, and I think a lot of the strongest arguments in favor of expressivism rely on intuitions. Also, I think that after reading some of the work of Mark Schroeder, I realized that I'm not really in a position to satisfactorily rebut the Frege-Geach problem, probably. But basically, what I like about the Cannibal Island thought experiment is that I think that it gets at what I find intuitively compelling about expressivism, even if I ultimately think it's a theory that we might need to reject for a variety of other reasons. I think the Cannibal Island thought experiment is a very simple, straightforward version of problems that have been laid out maybe in a more complicated manner elsewhere. There are, of course, other versions of the Cannibal Island thought experiment that have been put forward, or I guess newer versions of the problem that have been put forward, namely possibly Horgan and Timmons' moral to unearth thought experiment, which has been covered elsewhere on YouTube. And a lot of people think that Hare's thought experiment ultimately doesn't work, and we will consider why that might be a little bit later. One thing worth pointing out also is that this video contains my interpretation of his argument, including its aim and scope, and the way that the argument goes in premise-conclusion form. I'm open to suggestions about how I may have potentially misinterpreted Hare, certainly. And so if there are any ways in which I might have misinterpreted Hare, I'm open to discussing that in the comments. So now I'll say a couple words about RM Hare, although not all that much. He was a British moral philosopher who was born in 1919 and passed away in 2002. He taught at Oxford for a while. He also taught at the University of Florida for a large portion of his, or the later parts of his career. He developed a theory in moral language known as prescriptivism, according to which moral terms function grammatically like command statements. That is, they don't make claims about the way that the world is necessarily, but rather function more like statements that tell people what to do. And this is a version of non-cognitivism, according to which moral statements don't play the role of representing reality as being any particular way, but rather they express attitudes or desires or things like that that we may have. And we'll get into what exactly that involves a little bit in a second. So for the purposes of this lecture, I basically carve up the moral linguistic landscape into two paradigms. two ways of thinking about the nature of moral language that contrast with one another. There are various divisions that we can draw in metaethics with regard to the nature of moral language. We can talk about cognitivism versus non-cognitivism. I find it helpful to talk about expressivism versus descriptivism, and this is partly inspired by the way that Hare sets things up on the language of morals. But according to the descriptivist about moral language, moral terms function like other descriptive terms. That is, they describe the world as being a certain way. So consider a paradigmatic statement, a paradigmatic descriptive statement, the sky is blue, and I consider blue to be a paradigmatic descriptive term. Since blue is a descriptive term, when I attribute blueness to something, like I do to the sky in this particular statement, I'm representing it or describing it as being a certain way. I'm attributing the property of blueness to it. In other words, when I say something like the sky is blue, I am making a factual, descriptive claim about the way that the world is. And furthermore, the statement, the sky is blue, expresses a belief that I have about the world. Namely, a belief that the sky, in fact, has the property of being blue. According to expressivism, on the other hand, moral terms don't function like other descriptive terms. Rather than describing the world as being any particular way, they allow us to express our non-cognitive attitudes, like desires, preferences, etc., toward the world. Take a paradigmatic expressive statement like, go team. The expressive term here being go. Here I am not ascribing the team with the property of go, nor am I describing the team as being any particular way. Rather, I am putting go in front of team in order to express my pro-attitude towards the team. I'm not making a factual assertion about any way that the team is. Rather, I'm expressing my pro-attitude towards it. If expressivism is the correct theory of moral language, then moral terms function kind of like the term go. They express our attitudes toward the world, but they don't describe the world as being any particular way. When I say murder is wrong, I might mean, on some very simple expressivist theories, something akin to boo murder. Here I am not making a factual claim about the way that murder is, I'm just expressing an attitude towards it. Many believe that if expressivism is the correct theory of moral language, then there's no sense to be made of moral fact. Because in saying murder is wrong, I'm not even making a factual claim. I'm not even saying something that purports to be factual or to describe the world as being any particular way. And some people think, likewise, our moral judgments would be non-cognitive, meaning that they are desire-like or attitude-like, and this means that they are incapable of truth or falsity, since desires and attitudes themselves are incapable of truth or falsity. These are very controversial issues. There's a whole group of very smart people who completely disagree with this, namely the quasi-realists. I'm not going to address that debate here. Maybe it's something I'll discuss at some point in the future. Who knows? But for now, we'll simply discuss Hare's argument against descriptivism and in favor of expressivism. So, the setup of the Cannibal Island thought experiment begins like this. Let's imagine there exists what we could call a cannibal island, where the inhabitants believe it is right to scalp members of other tribes and eat their flesh. A group of Christian missionaries with their anti-cannibalism Christian morals go to this island with the intention of teaching the cannibals the error of their ways. For the sake of simplicity, Hare asks us to imagine that the cannibal term for good is coincidentally good, and their word for pious, meaning what is commanded by the Christian God, is also pious. For the purposes of clarity on my end, for the English term good, I will just spell it out as good normally. And for the cannibal term good, I will spell it out as good star, so that we can avoid some confusions in the future when I discuss this. And so the missionaries are attempting to translate the cannibal language into English so that they can converse with them. They want to know what the cannibal term is for good. Hare wants us to ask ourselves at this point, how would the missionaries go about translating English into the cannibal language and vice versa? He thinks that for ordinary terms that describe the world as being a certain way, such as red, what we would do is something like the following. We would essentially look at all of the things that we think are red and then figure out which term the cannibals use in order to refer to all and only red things. What term do they use in common between apples, blood, and cardinal feathers, for example? We would see what terms they use to refer to these particular things that we judge to be red. The interesting observation that Hare makes at this point, however, is that if we were to employ this method in translating moral terms, we would get the wildly wrong result. We wouldn't successfully be able to translate good star, which is the cannibal's actual word for good. The reason for this is that the Christians believe that all sorts of good things are pious. They might even believe that something is good if and only if it is pious, namely, if and only if it is what the Christian God commands. In virtue of this, the Christians believe that all sorts of things are good, like being altruistic and giving to charity and not eating flesh. And so they would look and see what kinds of terms the cannibals use in order to refer to things like being altruistic and not eating flesh. And of course, the cannibals would use the term pious star to refer to all of these things. But if the correct way to translate all descriptive terms involves defining them extensionally in this way, then, insofar as good functions like other descriptive terms, then the missionaries would have to think that the cannibal term pious star was the cannibal term for good. Or rather, another way of putting it would be something like, if descriptivism is true, then pious star would in fact be the correct translation for good. In other words, the English term good would mean pious star in cannibalese. But of course, as we stipulated at the beginning of the case, this is not in fact true. The cannibals clearly believe that scalping is good. They don't really care for pious things at all. They don't tell their children to do pious things at all. Or pious star things, to be more specific. And therefore, it's kind of obvious that the cannibals don't actually believe that things that are pious star are really morally good. But since descriptivism yields the wrong verdict in this case, we have reason to reject descriptivism. The argument, then, against descriptivism that Hare might begin with could go something like this. If descriptivism is true, then good in English means pious in cannibalese. Premise 2, good does not mean pious in cannibalese. Conclusion, descriptivism is false. And if we think expressivism is really the only alternative to descriptivism, as it probably is, although I guess I could be wrong about that, then this should cause us to believe that expressivism is true. Hare thinks that, as a matter of fact, the way that we would translate moral terms, the way that we would translate the cannibals' moral terms, would be by looking at what kinds of actions they actually praise other people for doing, what kinds of things they condemn other people for doing, what kinds of things they teach their children to do, etc., etc. But this seems to lend credence to the claim that to call something good just is to praise it or to recommend it in some kind of way, rather than to attribute it with having any particular property. This is how I essentially understand Hare's initial argument, and I consider it to be quite powerful. Something you might be thinking, however, is that somebody could just bite the bullet, so to speak, and accept that the correct translation of pious star is morally good. The idea is something like, maybe Hare is begging the question by just assuming that the cannibal term good is synonymous with our term good from the outset. In other words, that their term good star is synonymous with our term good from the outset. And so maybe premise 2 of the argument that I just gave sort of assumes the conclusion that Hare is trying to prove, namely that descriptivism is false. I think Hare has an interesting response to this kind of reply, however. The idea is ultimately that if we grant that pious star is the cannibal term for good in English, this leads to majorly unintuitive consequences, namely that the Christian missionaries and the cannibals don't have any major moral disagreements. That is, they both completely agree on what the moral facts are. But of course, this is absurd. The reason that this is the case is that if descriptivism is true, and the cannibal term pious star is their term for morally good, then whenever they say something is pious, what they really mean is that it's morally good. But this, of course, would mean that when they say not collecting scalps is pious, which is something that the cannibals would no doubt be willing to say, given that they do think that it is in fact commanded by the Christian God that we don't collect scalps, they're really saying that not collecting scalps is morally good. After all, what they mean when they say that something is good just is that it is pious. So, technically, the cannibals agree that not collecting scalps is morally good. When they go around saying collecting scalps is good in their language, namely, so saying that collecting scalps is good star, they're not really talking about moral goodness at all, they're talking about something else. They actually believe that collecting scalps is morally good, in spite of the fact that they have absolutely no interest in not collecting scalps, even though that they tell their children to collect scalps, etc., etc. Even though they condemn people for not collecting scalps and praise people for collecting scalps, they still don't actually believe that collecting scalps is morally permissible after all. So, in short, if descriptivism is true and pious star is their term for morally good, this would mean that the cannibals don't disagree with the missionaries over the immorality of collecting scalps. But of course, Hare wants us to see that this is absurd. Since the cannibals are going around praising people for collecting scalps and are recommending scalp collecting to everyone, and they condemn people for being pious, it is clear that they morally disagree with the missionaries, as a culture in general. So the premise conclusion version of this argument, then, would be something like this. Premise 1, if descriptivism is true, then the cannibals aren't engaged in a real moral disagreement with the missionaries. Premise 2, the cannibals are engaged in a real moral disagreement with the missionaries. Namely, they think collecting scalps is good and the Christians don't. Conclusion, descriptivism is false. So the idea is something like, you might try to say, pious star just is the Christian's term, just is the cannibal's term for morally good. But if this were true, we would also have to accept what seems to be an obviously false, counterintuitive consequence. But of course, if expressivism is true, we can explain why the missionaries and the cannibals are engaged in a real moral disagreement. If to have a moral belief is just to have a pro or con attitude towards certain things, it's clear that the cannibals have a pro attitude towards scalping and the Christians have a con attitude towards scalping. And if to believe that murder is permissible, if to believe that scalping is impermissible is just to have a con attitude towards it, and to believe that it's permissible is just to have a pro attitude of some kind towards it, since the Christians and the cannibals have the relevant attitudes, they're engaged in a bona fide moral disagreement. But there's another issue that you might raise in response to Hare's argument. Based on my understanding of the literature, Hare's argument is often discredited for the reason that I'm about to bring up, but I think that this is ultimately, potentially, not a good way of responding on intuitive grounds, although that's something worth exploring and discussing. I think the main reason most people discredit Hare's argument today is that we might not really have reason to believe that we wouldn't be able to translate the terms good properly just because descriptivism were true. That might just be an empirically false hypothesis about the way that translation works. And it also might be the case that we don't have to accept that if descriptivism is true, then good would mean pious star. After all, it seems as though people can disagree about the extension of a term and still mean the same thing by it. Consider two different Christians within the Christian missionary camp who disagree about what exact things are or are not blessed by God. They might apply the term blessed by God to radically different objects, in spite of the fact that they mean the same thing by blessed by God. It doesn't appear to be the case, then, that just because the same term has a radically different extension across two different speakers, that this implies that these speakers mean something different by that term. I find it worth pointing out that I probably don't take the Cannibal Island thought experiment to be conclusive evidence in favor of expressivism, largely because I take that first criticism very seriously. I'm not really sure exactly how empirical scientists go about translating terms in the field, I don't know what they have to say about how they would go about translating moral terms. And so I don't want to make speculations about how we ought to go about translating when I'm not a trained scientist who actually works in these fields, namely linguistics. Um, but for what it's worth, if we're going off of our intuitions, I actually don't think that the second point is particularly powerful. My reason for saying that is that it seems like, even in the case of the missionaries who disagree over what kinds of things are blessed by God, there is something shared in common with all of the things that they deem to be blessed by God. Namely, there are certain properties that the missionaries believe are held by all of these objects, and these kinds of properties are similar across the different speakers. So, for example, if I think this grail is blessed by God, and you think this robe is blessed by God, we might disagree over the extension of the term blessed by God, but we might both mean by the term blessed by God something akin to, well, was decreed to be holy by God or something like that, right? The property shared by everything that I claim to be blessed by God is those things that God declared to be holy, and the property shared by what somebody else claims to be blessed by God might be the same thing, namely the things that God declared to be holy. In virtue of this, it looks like, insofar as these different missionaries are using the term similarly, this is because there is something in common with their terms, even if the extension of their terms is ultimately different. It's unclear, however, what properties are shared in common between what the cannibals call good and what the missionaries call good. It seems possible that there isn't one thing shared between all and only good things according to the cannibals and all and only good things according to the missionaries. It seems like if descriptivism were true, then we should suspect that the cannibals and the Christians really do mean different things by good, but in which case we would run into the sort of relativism problems addressed earlier, according to which this would mean that they're not engaged in real moral disagreements. But once again, the expressivists can very easily explain why the missionaries and the cannibals are engaged in a real moral disagreement. To call something good is just to commend it, and so since the Christians and the missionaries commend different things, they disagree over what is good. It doesn't really matter that they commend radically different things. To call something good isn't to attribute it with any particular properties. So you can commend things for having all sorts of radically different properties. In short, it seems as though people can disagree over what property is shared by all and only good things, and yet they still mean the same thing by good. But this shouldn't be the case if descriptivism is true, because my intuition is generally that if two people disagree over what property is shared in common with all and only X things, then they simply mean different things by X. I currently don't put too much weight in any of the observations I've just made, however, since I realize that I'm making controversial statements in the philosophy of language, and I am by no means an expert in the philosophy of language. I realize there are all sorts of theories of meaning and reference and how terms gain their meaning that could ultimately allow us to directly tackle Hare's thought experiment. But if you're like me and you have generally the intuitions you're supposed to have, this thought experiment might actually be somewhat compelling to you. And so I hope that you have enjoyed the video. Feel free to comment with your thoughts on the thought experiment and my presentation of it. And I'm thinking about uploading more videos in the future on metaethical and metaphilosophical topics, so feel free to subscribe if you're interested. Thank you.